Alaska is a place where nature itself seems to keep its secrets and is in no hurry to share them with humans. The stories of Simon Clark, Wayne Malone, and Maria Hopper are just 3 chapters in a long book of disappearances that cannot be explained by conventional logic. A neatly rolled sleeping bag by a cliff, a boat with scratches on the bottom, glasses on a tree, a bag with bloodstains at the roots. All these clues look as if they were left there on purpose, like a riddle that no one has solved. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, and share your comments. Your participation inspires new videos. Now let's move on to inexplicable stories that leave more questions than answers. Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska is a place that inspires awe in and of itself. The largest national park in the United States, covering more than 13 million acres, it is a place where glaciers slide into narrow valleys and peaks over 16,000 feet high tower over the tundra and nameless streams. Here, humans are always guests, and more often than not, they are casual passers-by, almost invisible against the backdrop of the gigantic natural landscape. It was here in June 1992 that a 39-year-old Washington state resident named Simon Clark arrived. He was not a professional climber or geologist by training. Still, since his youth, he had been fascinated by cartography, rocks, and field expeditions. His home in Seattle was filled with boxes of rock samples, carefully labeled and arranged by year. For him, geology was not a profession but a passion, a way of understanding the world. That year, he planned a trip to the Nebezna Glacier, one of the most inaccessible places in Wrangell Cordillera National Park. His plan was relatively simple. A seaplane would take him to Lake Tana on June 15th. From there, he wanted to walk along the southern edge of the glacier, take a series of photographs, collect samples, and return to the lake by the 19th, where the pilot was to pick him up. Simon was born in 1953 in Tacoma, Washington. He was an electrical engineer by profession, but whenever he had the opportunity, he would head for the mountains. Friends described him as methodical, but sometimes overly confident in his abilities. He did not drink or smoke, always planned his routes carefully, and never went on a hike without leaving a note with his itinerary. For his trip to Alaska, he bought new equipment: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, climbing boots, and a navigation kit consisting of a USGS map and a compass. He did not have a satellite beacon. Such devices were still rare in 1992, but he always used simple methods to mark his route: bright ribbons, pieces of cloth on branches and cairns. His family and friends noted, Simon always left traces. He considered it his #1 safety rule. On June 15, 1992, a de Havilland Beaver seaplane took him to Lake Tana. Pilot George Wallace later said that Clark looked excited and focused. He checked his backpack, carefully secured his tent, and waved goodbye to the pilot. At that moment, there was no sign of trouble. Then there was silence. When the plane returned to the lake to pick him up on June 19th, Clark was nowhere to be found. There were no traces of a campfire or a tent on the shore. The pilot made several flyovers, nothing. A report was then filed with the National Park Service. The search began quickly. Rangers, pilots, and volunteers participated in the operation. The weather was cold, with rain and low clouds. For the first 2 days, the group searched the area around Lake Tana, to no avail. No tents, no stone cairns, no characteristic ribbons that Clark always used to mark his route were found. This immediately raised alarm bells. Clark never traveled without leaving markers. His friends who were involved in the search insisted that he was too disciplined to make such a mistake. But the terrain behaved differently. It was as if his presence had been erased. On the 5th day of the search, June 24th, volunteers stumbled upon a sleeping bag. It lay neatly rolled up on a stone platform near a cliff, 6 miles east of the lake. The sleeping bag was dry and clean, as if it had just been taken out of a tent and placed on the ground. There were no other belongings nearby: no tent, no backpack, no clothes. There were not even any traces of a campfire. The ground around it was wet from rain, but the sleeping bag was dry, as if it had been placed there very recently. Another oddity: a few yards from the find, there were faint traces of a grizzly bear, but they did not lead to the sleeping bag, but away from it, gradually disappearing into the grass. The ranger's report later noted, "It has not been determined why the sleeping bag was left in such an open place, with no signs of anyone having been there." The Clark family was particular that if he had folded the sleeping bag himself, he would have done so at the camp or on the trail, but not on the edge of a cliff. After the sleeping bag was found, the search continued with renewed vigor. The National Park Service brought in additional teams. 2 helicopter crews, dog handlers, and about 30 volunteers who were experienced hikers. The primary focus was on the area along the Nebezna Glacier. It seemed apparent that this was where Clark might have headed, and that this was where his markers should have been. However, to the astonishment of all involved, no markers were found. Not a single ribbon, not a single rope, not even a twig bent by a human hand. It was as if Simon had moved cleanly, leaving no trace. This was entirely out of character for him. His sister Carol, who flew to Alaska, later said, "If you walk through the woods and don't see any markers, then it's not Simon. He couldn't have forgotten. It's part of his character." The search then took on an almost mystical tone. On June 29th, 2 weeks after his disappearance, a group of volunteers found a boot about 7 miles northeast of the lake. It was a solo climbing boot, in good condition, with the laces intact and minimal signs of wear. But the way it was found shocked everyone. The boot was in a narrow crevice between 2 rocks. It hadn't just fallen there, but seemed to have been stuck there with force. It was stuck vertically, toe down, so deep that it could only be pulled out with the help of a crowbar. The outside of the boot was relatively dry, while the inside was damp, but showed no signs of prolonged exposure to rain. There was no body or other items nearby, no socks, no backpack, no traces of human presence. Only this boot, stuck in such a way that it seemed as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Experts immediately noted that if the boot had simply fallen off the foot during a fall or while walking, it would have remained on the surface. To achieve that level of depth, considerable effort would have been required. By this point, the search operation had been going on for more than 2 weeks. No tent, no backpack, no other pieces of clothing, no blood, no bones, no personal belongings. The traces on the ground ended abruptly, as if the man had ceased to exist in that place. Biologists from the University of Alaska, called in for consultation, ruled out a bear attack. An attack always leaves traces of a struggle: fur, scraps of clothing, blood. There is nothing here. Dog handlers came to the same conclusion. The dogs picked up Simon's scent only on a short stretch near the lake, but then lost it completely. Special attention was paid to the question of route markers. Simon's relatives and friends insisted that he never traveled without leaving marks, but this time there were none. A hypothesis arose. Perhaps he deliberately removed them, deciding to keep his route a secret. But why? And why then was his sleeping bag neatly rolled up at the edge of the cliff and his boot stuck in a crevice? Simon's sister Carol and 2 friends flew to Alaska to join the search. They noted several oddities that were not included in the official reports but were discussed among a small group of volunteers. Several searchers indicated that there was an unnatural silence in the area where the sleeping bag was found. No birds were singing, not even the sound of the wind. "It was as if the sound had disappeared," said one of the rangers. 2 volunteers claimed to have smelled a strong metallic odor, like rust or blood, although there were no animal remains or traces of a fire nearby. The search dogs refused twice to go beyond a certain point on the trail, growling and backing away. This was recorded in the search team's log, but the official reports emphasized the lack of traces for analysis. For the Clark family, the main shock was that he seemed to have disappeared completely. No documents, no knife, not even a mug, although usually at least some of a tourist's belongings are found. Only 2 items were found here: a sleeping bag and a boot. The official investigation ultimately came to a cautious conclusion. The cause of Simon Clark's disappearance could not be established. Animal attack and accident have been ruled out as unlikely. There were various unofficial versions. Falling into a crevasse. Some believed that Clark could have walked onto the glacier and fallen into a crevasse that was covered by snow. This would explain the absence of a body, but it does not explain why his sleeping bag was found rolled up at the edge of a cliff, and his boot was found crushed in a crevasse 7 miles away. Another theory was that he wanted to disappear and start a new life. But some things spoke against this. He left his documents, money, and his beloved mineral collection at home. There were no signs that he wanted to disappear. Sometimes the possibility of foul play was discussed. Someone could have encountered him in the mountains. But the area was completely deserted. Not a single camp was recorded within a 30-mile radius during those days. A search for volunteers from among supporters of anomalous hypotheses gathered a collection of similar stories from Alaska, people whose traces had been lost, whose belongings had been found neatly folded in illogical places. In 1993 and 1994, repeated searches were conducted during the warmer months. Volunteers searched riverbeds, rock slides, and even caves in the rock formations, but again nothing. Simon Clark's relatives only achieved official recognition of his death in 1997, 5 years after his disappearance. But neither they nor many of the searchers could accept that a man had simply vanished, leaving behind only 2 items that looked as if they had been deliberately placed there by someone. To this day, no one knows where Simon Clark ended up on that June day in 1992. In July 1996, a 42-year-old fisherman from Utah named Wayne Malone disappeared in Clark Lake National Park. He rented a small cabin for a week and told the owner by radio that he was going fishing on the morning of July 14th. He did not return that evening. The search began the next day. Almost immediately, his boat was found 3 miles downstream. It was intact, the motor was in working order, but the key had been removed, as if someone had deliberately stalled the engine. Inside was a fishing rod, a bucket of fresh fish, and a neatly folded jacket. Strange, deep scratches, like fingernail marks, were found on the aluminium bottom, as if someone had desperately tried to hold on. Still, there were no other signs of a struggle or accident. When the boat was examined more closely, it became clear that the theory of falling overboard did not explain the details. If Malone really fell, why was the engine stopped manually? If he was thrown out, where were the marks on the shore or in the water? Rangers and volunteers flew over the entire area in helicopters and seaplanes. Boats combed the coastline and divers checked the most dangerous places. Still, no trace of a body was found. Dogs brought in to search confidently followed the trail from the cockpit to the shore, but at the spot where the boat was found, they lost the trail completely, as if the man had simply vanished. The case was becoming increasingly alarming. One of the rangers later recalled that in his years of service, he had seen dozens of accidents on the water, but this story immediately defied logic. It was as if someone had swept it away, he said. On the 4th day of the search, local residents joined the effort. It was then that volunteers made a discovery that only added to the sense of mystery surrounding the incident. In the fork of a tree, nearly 9 feet above the ground, lay Malone's sunglasses, neatly arranged. There were no human footprints or broken grass below. The glasses were intact, the lenses undamaged, and it looked as if they had been deliberately placed there. This detail baffled the searchers. Even experienced trackers could not explain how the item could have ended up in such a place. The bear attack theory was investigated immediately. In Alaska, this is always the first assumption. But no hair, blood, or characteristic paw prints were found around the boat. In addition, the fish in the bucket remained untouched, and it was unlikely that the animal would have ignored such easy prey. The idea that the man could have drowned was also not supported. The water in that area was not deep enough for the body not to float to the surface within a few days. Relatives insisted that Wayne had always been very organized. He had a habit of marking his route by making notches or leaving ribbons. This made his disappearance even stranger, as there was no sign that he had marked the trail. It seemed as if he had failed to do so for the first time in his life. By the end of July, the active search began to wind down. Dozens of people, from rangers to volunteers, combed the area, but all they found during that time was a boat with scratches on the bottom and a pair of glasses in a tree. Official reports dryly stated, "No logical explanation." For Malone's family and friends, it became unbearable. His disappearance turned into one of those Alaskan mysteries where every detail only adds to the sense of incomprehension, and obvious explanations fall apart at the first careful glance. When local newspapers began to write about the strange disappearance of a fisherman from Utah, interest in the case skyrocketed. Wayne Malone was known as a practical man with experience in hiking and fishing. His friends insisted that he never took unnecessary risks and treated nature with respect. For his family, the idea that he could have accidentally fallen into the water or died from stupidity seemed impossible. Relatives insisted on expanding the search, and then the FBI got involved as the disappearance occurred within a national park and was accompanied by circumstances that did not fit the usual versions. All the materials were analyzed during August. The ranger's report on the boat contained a note. The scratches on the bottom looked like they had been made by fingernails, but in the official document this was phrased more mildly as undetermined damage. The photos of the boat taken immediately after its discovery were never made public. Several searchers admitted in private conversations that what they saw was extremely disturbing. It looked as if a person had been in a panic and scratched the metal trying to stay inside. The glasses in the fork of a tree became the second unsolvable mystery. Investigators suggested that they could have been brought there by the wind or a bird. However, the glasses were heavy, with metal frames, and no bird could have placed them neatly in the fork. Moreover, no strong winds were reported in the area during the search. The FBI reports also mention this episode, but without attempting to explain it, they simply state that the item was found where it could not have ended up naturally. With each passing day, it became increasingly clear that Wayne's body would not be found. Usually, drowned bodies float to the surface within 3-5 days. Even assuming that he had been carried away by the current, the area searched covered dozens of miles down the river, and the chances of finding his remains were extremely high. But the search yielded absolutely nothing. There was no piece of clothing, no footprints, no bones, not even any objects that could have washed ashore. Everything disappeared with him. This disappearance was recorded as a case with no logical explanation. Journalists writing about it called it a case with no version. Against the backdrop of routine accidents and tourist deaths, the case seemed eerily empty. It was as if Malone's disappearance itself was pushing people to think that there was something more to it than a simple tragedy. All that remained for the family was speculation. His wife said that Wayne was a man of habit. He always packed his things neatly, and that was precisely what was found in the boat: a folded jacket, a fishing rod, and neatly caught fish. It looked as if he intended to return in a few minutes, but he never returned. In its annual report, the FBI listed Malone's case separately, with the note, "No signs of violence, no explanation." This is a rare wording, as usually at least the most likely cause is indicated: drowning, accident, animal attack. In this case, even that was not done. Over time, Wayne Malone's story became a local legend. Fishermen and residents of Lake Clark said that since then, they had become more cautious about going out alone. Several times, people claimed to have seen a boat slowly drifting without an owner, but when they approached, it was empty. This coincidence always reminded them of that July day in 1996. That's how it remained: a boat with scratches, neatly left belongings, glasses on a tree, and no body. For the record, it was an unexplained disappearance. For the family, it was an eternal question with no answer. For investigators of such cases, it was another story that fit into a long series of mysterious disappearances in Alaska, where nature seems to be able to hide people without a trace. The Tongass National Forest, the largest in the United States, covers more than 16 million acres. This place is a combination of misty fjords, cold streams, ancient fir trees, and mountains sloping down to the water. Tourists who come here often say that they feel cut off from the world. Phone service is rare, civilization seems far away, and nature itself seems to repel any human attempts to interfere with its rhythm. In July 1998, a 29-year-old traveler from Virginia named Maria Hopper arrived here. She was no stranger to camping. She had hiked the Appalachian Trail, spent nights in the Rocky Mountains, and traveled to western national parks. Her friends noted that Maria always took preparation seriously. She checked her equipment twice, kept her things in order, and always left a detailed itinerary when traveling alone. She arrived in Tongass as part of a more extended trip through Alaska. According to her family, the purpose of the trip was to listen to the silence and live in solitude for a few days. She rented a spot at a small campground near Sitka Creek, popular with fishermen and those who prefer short stays in the woods. There are only a few campsites, each surrounded by trees and overlooking the fast-flowing stream. According to their campsite neighbors, a couple from Seattle, Maria seemed calm and content on the evening of July 17th. They remembered her slender figure, her hair pulled back in a bun, and the harmonica she played by the campfire. It was around 9 p.m. The couple later recalled, "It sounded unexpectedly cozy. She was playing a simple melody and the whole forest seemed to freeze." They went to bed around 10:30 p.m., and when they woke up in the morning, they noticed the silence. There was no smoke from the campfire. Maria's tent looked open, and the girl herself was nowhere to be seen. At 8 a.m., they approached the tent. Inside, they found a backpack, neatly zipped up. A lantern lay on the ground nearby, turned off. The tent was unzipped, as if it had been abandoned in a hurry, but there was no mess. There were no shoes or jackets. Everything remained in place, including food and documents. At first, they thought Maria had left early in the morning for a short walk, but with each passing minute, their concern grew. By noon, not having waited for her, they informed the campground manager, who contacted the rangers. A search began immediately. In the first few hours, the search party expected to find Maria's tracks right next to the camp. However, there was nothing around the tent, no footprints in the damp ground, no broken branches, no distinctive shoe marks. It was as if a person had simply vanished into the night. 200 yards from the camp, in an area with thick roots from an old fallen tree, they found the only item, a small hygiene bag wrapped in a gray t-shirt. Inside were soap, a toothbrush, and a comb. The t-shirt itself had brown stains, dried and blurred. There were traces of blood on the toothbrush. An examination later confirmed the presence of blood. Still, its origin could not be determined. At that time, DNA testing was not yet widely used for all such cases, and there was not enough material. The strangeness of the find added to the anxiety. Why did Maria leave at night without her shoes and jacket, leaving everything in the tent? Why did she take the bag with her toiletries but leave it next to the tree roots, wrapped in her t-shirt? And most importantly, whose blood was on the toothbrush? 3 days after her disappearance, heavy rains washed away any possible traces in the area around the stream. Search dogs were unable to pick up the scent more than a few dozen feet from the tent. Volunteers combed the stream bed, woods, and rocky areas, but the body or other belongings were never found. Neighbors at the camp emphasized in their statements that they had not heard any suspicious noises, screams, or footsteps. That night, there was almost complete silence. Their tent was only 160 feet from Maria's camp, and if something loud had happened, they would have heard it. But they heard nothing. The official report would later call it a disappearance under unknown circumstances. To Maria's family, that sounded hollow. She disappeared without a fight, without a trace, without an explanation, leaving behind only a harmonica by a dead campfire and a strange bag with bloodstains. The search for Maria Hopper continued for 2 weeks. Rangers, volunteers from local communities, search dogs, and even a helicopter from Sitka took part. But the more they searched the area, the less hope there was. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no personal belongings were found, except for the hygiene bag. It was as if the girl had simply walked out of the tent and vanished into thin air. The Sitka Creek near where her camp was located was searched particularly thoroughly. The water there is cold but not too deep. If Maria had accidentally slipped, her body would have been found downstream sooner or later. But that didn't happen. The slopes around the campsite were also searched, but no signs of a fall or accident were found. One of the volunteers who participated in the search recalled, "We were hoping for at least a small clue, a piece of fabric, a broken bush, but nothing. Just that shirt and the brush with blood on it. It didn't look right. It was as if someone had taken her out and left her there on purpose." Maria's family flew in from Virginia on the 3rd day after her disappearance. Her brother John said in an interview with a local newspaper, Maria was always careful. She didn't go out barefoot at night, nor did she go far away alone. If she decided to go somewhere, she would have taken a flashlight and her boots. Something happened and we don't know what. Investigators put forward several theories. The first was that she left voluntarily, but all her belongings, including her documents and money, were left in the tent. Besides, why would she go at night without shoes? The second was an attack by a wild animal, but there were no signs of a struggle in or around the tent, and the blood-stained t-shirt found looked more like a rag that someone had used to wipe their hands. The third theory was an accident in the forest, but then they should have found a body, or at least signs of a fall, and the forest had been combed through dozens of times. In the archives, Maria Hopper's case remained unsolved. The documents stated explicitly, no logical explanation for the behavior or the clues found. For the Tongass Rangers, her disappearance became one of the most puzzling cases of the decade. Over the years, the legend of the girl with the harmonica has become part of the oral history of the local residents. Tourists visiting the campground near Sitka Creek sometimes hear stories about how, on summer nights, a quiet melody can be heard in the distance, as if someone is playing a harmonica by the campfire. The facts remain the same. In July 1998, 29-year-old Maria Hopper sat down by the campfire in the evening, and in the morning she was gone. All that remained was her tent, a harmonica, and a strange bag with bloodstains. Everything else is just speculation. Her body was never found. That's all. If you found this interesting, subscribe and write in the comments which of these stories struck you the most. There are even more creepy and inexplicable disappearances ahead that are impossible to explain.